The encounter. The battlefield was chaos. Explosions tore through the air, and the ground shook beneath Sergeant Kel Thorne's boots. The sharp smell of burning metal and the cries of wounded soldiers filled the barren plains of Vorel Prime. Kel's squad was deep behind enemy lines, their mission simple but dangerous: infiltrate a Drawl outpost and secure vital intelligence. Kel crouched behind a shattered wall, his pulse rifle gripped tightly in his hands. "Squad, move up," he ordered through the comlink. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded. Every step closer to the enemy stronghold felt like walking into the jaws of a beast. The Drawl were brutal and relentless, their reptilian forms built for war. But humans had proven time and time again that they could fight harder, smarter, and with more determination. Kel's squad was no exception. They reached the outpost, a crumbling structure half buried in the dusty terrain. The squad spread out, scanning for hostiles. The place seemed abandoned, but Kel's instincts told him otherwise. "Clear the rooms. Watch for traps," Kel instructed. The team moved with precision, covering each other as they swept through the outpost. Kel entered what looked like a command center. The consoles were destroyed, their screens shattered, but a faint hum of energy caught his attention. He followed the sound down a narrow corridor, his boots crunching on debris. At the end of the corridor, Kel found a heavy metal door. It was half open, and beyond it was a dimly lit room. The hum grew louder. Kel signaled for his squad to hold position and stepped inside. The room was small and cold, with walls lined with strange alien symbols. In the center was a single cell. Inside, curled up against the far wall, was a girl. Kel froze. She wasn't Drawl. Her skin was pale, almost luminous, and her hair was a shimmering silver that seemed to catch the faint light in the room. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were silver too, glowing faintly, and they stared at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Sergeant, what is it?" came a voice over the comlink. Kel didn't answer immediately. He approached the cell cautiously, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready. The girl didn't move, but her eyes followed him. She was thin, her clothes torn and stained, and she clutched something tightly in her hands. Kel stopped a few feet from the cell. "Who are you?" he asked. The girl didn't respond. Her grip on the object in her hands tightened. It looked like a small oval artifact, covered in glowing lines that pulsed faintly. Kel glanced back toward the door, where two of his squad members now stood, their weapons drawn. "Sergeant, is that a prisoner?" one of them asked. "She doesn't look like a Drow prisoner," Kel said, his voice low. He turned back to the girl. "We're not here to hurt you. What's your name?" The girl finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "They called me a weapon," she said, "but I don't belong to them." Before Kel could ask what she meant, the artifact in her hands began to hum louder. The pulsing lines grew brighter, casting strange shadows on the walls. "Sergeant, we need to leave now," one of his men said urgently. Kel knew they couldn't stay long. The Drawl would return soon, and they couldn't afford to be caught. But something about the girl tugged at him. She didn't belong here, and whatever that artifact was, it was important, too important to leave behind. "We're taking her with us," Kel said, making his decision. His squad exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir, we don't know what she is." "She could be dangerous," one of them said. "Everything here is dangerous," Kel replied. He raised his rifle and shot the lock on the cell. The girl flinched but didn't move as the door swung open. "Can you walk?" Kel asked her. She hesitated, then nodded. Slowly, she stood, clutching the artifact to her chest. Kel motioned for her to follow. As they made their way out of the outpost, the ground trembled. A low rumble echoed through the air, and Kel's comlink crackled with static. "Sergeant, we got incoming," a voice shouted. Kel cursed under his breath. The Drawl were back, and they weren't going to let anyone leave alive. The girl suddenly stopped, her silver eyes wide. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "What?" Cale asked, confused. Before she could answer, the artifact in her hands flared with a blinding light. Cale felt a strange pull, like the ground was shifting beneath him. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The battlefield, the comlink, even his own heartbeat. When the light faded, Cale was on his knees, gasping for air. Around him, his squad was in disarray, and the girl was staring at the artifact, her expression unreadable. "What the hell just happened?" one of his men demanded. Cale didn't have an answer. All he knew was that nothing about this mission was going to be simple anymore. "Move out," he barked, shaking off the unease. They had to get back to base and figure out who this girl really was before it was too late. As they retreated into the night, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that they had just unleashed something far bigger than any of them could understand. The retreat, the silence felt wrong. Sergeant Cale Thorne's squad moved carefully through the jagged remains of the Drawl outpost, but the usual sounds of war, distant gunfire, explosions and screams, had faded into an eerie quiet. Even the wind had stilled. Cale glanced at the alien girl walking a few steps behind him. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the cracked stone, and she clutched the strange artifact to her chest, like it was part of her. His second in command, Corporal Haynes, leaned in close as they navigated the ruins. "Sir, this is weird. Feels like we're walking through a ghost town. Where'd all the Drawl go?" Cale's grip tightened on his rifle. "I don't know, but stay sharp. Just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not watching." Haynes frowned but said nothing more. They moved quickly, slipping between broken walls and shattered towers, but Cale could feel the unease spreading through his squad like a virus. None of them had forgotten the blinding flash from the artifact, or the strange way the air seemed to bend around the girl when he freed her. No one dared say it aloud, but Cale knew what they were thinking. She wasn't normal, and maybe she wasn't safe. 30 minutes into the retreat, Cale signaled the squad to take cover along a rocky ridge overlooking the valley below. The Drawl forces were supposed to be advancing from the south, but the entire valley lay empty. No enemy movement. No vehicles. "Where the hell are they?" Haynes muttered, scanning with his scope. Cale pulled out his own binoculars. From this high up, he should have been able to see the burning wreckage from the earlier skirmish, but the battlefield was pristine. No bodies, no craters. It was as if the fight had never happened. Cale lowered the binoculars slowly. "Check comms," he ordered. Private Marks fiddled with his equipment, shaking his head. "Still nothing, sir. It's like the whole damn frequency's jammed." Cale looked over his shoulder at the girl. She sat quietly against a stone slab, her glowing silver eyes locked onto the horizon. She hadn't spoken since they left the outpost. He approached her, crouching down to her level. "Is this you?" Cale asked, his voice calm but firm. The silence, the lack of drawl. "Did you do something with that artifact?" The girl met his gaze, unblinking. "It's not me," she said softly. "It's them. They're waiting." Cale narrowed his eyes. "Who's waiting?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around the artifact. "The ones the Drawl fear." Before Cale could press further, Haynes whistled sharply. "We've got movement." The squad immediately took defensive positions. Cale's heart raced as he raised his weapon. Shadows flickered along the far ridge, but instead of Drawl warriors, dark humanoid figures emerged, gliding silently across the landscape. They weren't Drawl. Cale's stomach knotted. He didn't recognize these creatures, but the way the girl watched them, calm, almost expectant, made him uneasy. "They won't hurt me," she said, "but they might hurt you." "Good to know," Cale muttered, keeping his rifle aimed. "Squad, stay low. Don't engage unless necessary." The figures didn't approach further. They stopped at the valley's edge, standing motionless like sentinels. Cale didn't like it. The Drawl were brutal, but predictable. This, This felt like something ancient. "Let's move," Kale ordered, ushering his squad down the ridge. Nightfall. The squad settled into an abandoned drill bunker for the night. They took turns keeping watch, but even in the silence, Kale couldn't sleep. The girl sat by a rusted console, tracing her fingers over the broken controls. The artifact pulsed faintly in her lap, casting shadows that flickered strangely across the walls. Kale approached her, lowering his voice. "Who are you really?" She paused, as if considering whether to answer. "I told you. I was their prisoner." "I don't buy that," Kale replied. "The Drawl don't treat their prisoners this way. They fear you." The girl's silver eyes locked onto his. "They fear what I can become." Kale exhaled slowly. "And what is that?" Her gaze dropped to the artifact. "A key, or a weapon. It depends on who holds me." Before Kale could respond, Marks, who had been keeping watch at the entrance, whispered urgently, "Sergeant, we got more of those things out there." Kale moved to the entrance. In the moonlight, the dark figures were gathering again, this time closer. "They're getting bold," Haynes said grimly. "No," the girl corrected softly. "They're getting curious." Kale stared at the gathering figures. Curious about what? The girl looked directly at him. "You." Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at the squad, seasoned soldiers who had fought the worst the galaxy had to offer, and saw that same cold dread reflected in their eyes. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. "Pack up," Kale ordered. "We're leaving at first light." But even as the squad prepared, Kale knew deep down, those things wouldn't let them leave so easily. Questions in the dark. The fire crackled softly in the center of the old bunker, but its light barely touched the corners of the room. Shadows stretched long and thin across the cold walls, making the place feel like a tomb. Cal Thorne sat with his back to the door, his rifle across his lap. His squad huddled nearby, speaking in low voices, though none of them said what was really on their minds. The girl sat apart from them, her silver eyes reflecting the flames as she cradled the strange artifact. It hadn't stopped glowing since they left the outpost. Cal's eyes never left her. "You don't sleep," he said finally. The girl looked up, her expression unreadable. "Neither do you." Cal didn't respond. She wasn't wrong. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flickering figures from the ridge, silent watchers that didn't belong to this war. And somehow, he knew she was connected to them. "I need answers," Cal said, keeping his voice even. "That thing you're holding." The Drawl wanted it, but they didn't dare touch it. Why? The girl's fingers brushed over the artifact's surface, tracing the glowing lines as if she were reading a book only she could understand. "It's not meant for them," she said softly. Cal leaned forward slightly. "And it is meant for you." Her gaze met his. "I don't know, but it woke up when you came." Cal's jaw tightened. "Woke up?" She nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "The Drawl found me on a dead world. I don't remember how long I was there, but they were afraid to kill me. They thought keeping me close might keep the artifact silent." Cal glanced at the device in her hands. It hummed faintly, the sound just soft enough to feel more like breathing than machinery. "And now?" Cal asked. The girl hesitated, her eyes flickering to the shadows along the far side of the bunker. "Now it's listening." Cal followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just the empty darkness. His comlink crackled. It wasn't connected to any channel, but the static felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to speak without words. Haynes shifted uncomfortably across the room. "I don't like this, Sarge. We need to ditch that thing and get out of here." Cal didn't blame him. The air felt heavier, and even the fire's warmth couldn't chase away the cold crawling up his spine. But leaving the artifact wasn't an option. "I'm not leaving without answers," Cal said, louder this time. His squad fell silent. He turned back to the girl. "You told me the Drawl called you a weapon. What did they mean by that?" The girl's grip on the artifact tightened. Because I'm the only one who can open the gate. Cal's blood ran cold. What gate? The one that keeps them out, she whispered. Cal's mind raced. The figures we saw earlier, are they trying to get through? The girl nodded slowly. They've been waiting for a long time. But the droll didn't understand. They thought they could use the gate to win the war. Cal glanced at Haynes, who shifted nervously. This was no longer about the Drell or some routine skirmish. This was something far older. Cal exhaled sharply, rubbing his eyes. So let me guess. Now that the artifact is awake, they know exactly where we are. Yes, she said quietly. Cal cursed under his breath. Before he could say more, the bunker lights flickered. Everyone froze. Marks, check the perimeter, Cal ordered. Marks nodded, moving carefully to the entrance. The girl watched him go, her expression calm but distant, like she already knew what he'd find. Moments later, Mark's voice echoed through the comlink. Sarge, you need to see this. Cal rose, motioning for Haynes to stay behind with the girl. He stepped out into the cold night air, rifle at the ready. Marks pointed toward the ridge. Cal's heart sank. The figures were back. Dozens of them now, standing still, just at the edge of the firelight. Their forms shimmered like smoke, but their eyes, cold and glowing, locked directly onto Cal. They're not attacking, Marks whispered. Cal nodded grimly. Because they don't need to. Not yet. The girl's voice drifted from behind them. They're waiting for the gate to open, she said softly, standing just outside the bunker. Cal turned to her, stepping closer. Then tell me how we stop it. The girl looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, he saw something close to fear in her eyes. We can't, she said. It's already opening. Cal's pulse quickened, and he stared out at the distant figures, knowing that whatever came next, they weren't ready for it. The chase begins. The fire had burned out by the time Sergeant Cal Thorne realized the girl was gone. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the calm, peaceful kind, the heavy, oppressive kind that sat in his chest like a weight. His squad was still sleeping, weapons within reach, but Cal's instincts screamed at him. He rose to his feet, scanning the dark interior of the bunker. The empty spot where the girl had been sitting felt wrong, as if the shadows themselves had swallowed her. Cal's rifle was in his hands before he even thought about it. Haynes, wake up, he said quietly, nudging his second in command. Haynes blinked blearily. What's going on? She's gone. Haynes sat up immediately, grabbing his weapon. Damn it. I knew this was a bad idea. Cal ignored him, already moving toward the entrance. The cold night air hit him like a wall as he stepped outside. The stars above Vorel Prime flickered dimly, and the crumbling ruins stretched endlessly beneath them. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. Cal's gaze shifted to the ridge where the figures had stood the night before. It was empty now. She's not far, Cal said, more to himself than to Haynes. You sure about that? Haynes grumbled as he caught up. Cal didn't answer. His gut told him the girl hadn't run. Not from them. She was chasing something. Something she wasn't ready to face. Or maybe something was chasing her. An hour later, Cal moved quietly through the ruins, Haynes trailing a few steps behind him. The faint hum of the artifact still echoed in his ears, even though the girl had taken it with her. She's leaving a trail, Haynes muttered, pointing to faint scorch marks along the stones. It's like the ground reacts to that thing she's carrying. Cal crouched beside the marks. They pulsed faintly with residual energy, still warm to the touch. Whatever the artifact was, it left traces in its wake. She's not even trying to hide, Cal said. Or she doesn't care if we follow, Haynes replied grimly. Cal rose, eyes narrowing toward the far end of the ruins. A faint flicker of light danced between the broken pillars. The girl's silhouette stood against the glow. She was waiting. Cal and Haynes approached cautiously, weapons lowered but ready. You didn't have to follow me, the girl said without turning around. Kale stepped closer. You didn't have to leave. She finally faced him, her silver eyes catching the faint starlight. The artifact hummed faintly in her hands. I had to see if they were still here. Kale's brow furrowed. Who? The Forgotten, she whispered. Haynes exhaled sharply. You keep saying things like that, but it doesn't mean much to us, kid. Who are the Forgotten? The girl hesitated, as if searching for the right words. They're the ones who lost this war long before you started fighting it. Cal's eyes narrowed. You're saying they're ancient Droll? She shook her head. No, they were something else. The Droll tried to erase them. Cal crossed his arms. And now they're back. They never left, the girl said softly. Cal opened his mouth to press further, but the air shifted suddenly. The cold grew sharper, and the shadows at the edges of the ruins thickened unnaturally. They found us, the girl said quietly. Cal's grip tightened on his rifle. Haynes, get the squad moving. Now. Haynes was already on his comlink, but static hissed back at him. He shook his head. Comms are dead again. Cal cursed. The shadows around the ruins began to ripple, and the flickering figures appeared once more. This time, they weren't standing still. They were moving toward them. Cal stepped in front of the girl, rifle raised. Stay behind me. I told you, she said softly. They're not here for me. Cal didn't lower his weapon. The figures drew closer, their forms shifting like smoke. Cal fired a warning shot into the air, but the bullet passed through the nearest figure as if it weren't there. Bullets won't stop them, the girl said. Great, Haynes muttered. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Cal clenched his jaw. Then what will? The girl glanced at the artifact. The gate isn't fully open yet, but it's close. If we leave now, we might be able to stop it before. A low, resonating hum interrupted her, coming from deep beneath the ground. Cal's eyes widened. Before what? Before she could answer, the ruins trembled violently. The artifact in her hands flared, casting a blinding light across the landscape. When the light faded, the figures were gone. But Cal knew they hadn't disappeared. They were just waiting for the right moment to return. The awakening. The Droll didn't kneel for anyone. Cal Thorne had fought them long enough to know that. They were brutal, unrelenting warriors, forged in the fires of conquest. Their warlords crushed entire colonies without hesitation. Yet now, as Cal and his squad stood at the edge of a cracked stone plateau, they watched in disbelief as an entire battalion of Droll warriors slowly bent the knee. Not to Cal, to the girl. She stood at the heart of the formation, silver eyes glowing faintly beneath the pale light of the twin moons. The artifact hummed in her hands, casting thin veins of light across the ground. Cal's rifle hung loosely at his side. His squad shifted uneasily behind him, unsure if they should lower their weapons or raise them higher. Haynes broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarge, what the hell is this? Cal didn't answer. His focus stayed on the Droll warlord at the front of the formation. The warlord's armor was heavier than that of his soldiers, lined with jagged edges and scars from countless battles. His yellow eyes flicked to Cal only once before fixing on the girl. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like stone grinding against metal. We searched the stars for you, the warlord said, speaking in broken English. His gaze never left the girl. And now you return. The blood of the Forgotten still runs through your veins. The girl's expression remained calm, but Cal noticed how tightly she gripped the artifact. I didn't ask to return, she replied softly. The warlord rose slowly from his kneeling position. That is not for you to decide. Cal stepped forward. She's not going anywhere with you. The warlord's gaze snapped toward Cal, and for a moment, the two locked eyes. You misunderstand, human, the warlord said, his voice colder now. This is not your war. Step aside. Cal's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. If it wasn't my war before, it sure as hell is now. The warlord's soldiers stirred, but the warlord raised his hand, silencing them. Cale felt Haynes tense beside him. "Sarge, I'm pretty sure we're outnumbered." "We've been outnumbered before," Cale muttered. The warlord studied Cale for a long moment, then turned his attention back to the girl. "You know what lies beyond the gate," the warlord said. "The Drawl cannot stop it alone. But with you, we can hold them back." The girl's eyes flickered with something Cale couldn't place. Fear, perhaps, or maybe recognition. "I'm not a weapon," she said quietly. The warlord took a step closer. "You are the only weapon left." Cale moved instinctively, placing himself between the warlord and the girl. His squad mirrored his stance, raising their rifles. "I don't think she wants your offer," Cale said firmly. For a moment, the warlord said nothing. Then, slowly, a low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound somewhere between amusement and warning. "You think you can protect her?" the warlord asked. "You cannot protect what you do not understand." Cale tightened his grip on his weapon. "Maybe not, but I'm willing to try." The warlord's gaze hardened, and Cale knew the tension was seconds from breaking. But before anyone could move, the artifact flared in the girl's hands, and the entire plateau trembled beneath their feet. A crack of energy split the sky overhead, and for a brief moment, the figures Cale had seen before, the dark shapes that had been following them, flashed along the horizon. The Drawl soldiers shifted uneasily, and even the warlord's confidence wavered for half a breath. The girl lowered the artifact, her voice soft but resolute. "They're already coming," she said. "It doesn't matter what any of us want." Cale's pulse quickened. The energy in the air was impossible to ignore now. The warlord's gaze lingered on the girl for a long moment before he finally took a step back. "If you will not come willingly," the warlord said, "then you will face what comes alone." Cale exhaled slowly as the warlord signaled his battalion. The Drell soldiers rose in unison, backing away from the plateau. Haynes watched them retreat, shaking his head. "I can't believe they're just walking away." "They're not walking away," Cale said quietly, eyes fixed on the girl. "They're waiting for us to fail." The girl met Cale's gaze, and for the first time since he found her, she looked afraid. "They won't have to wait long," she said softly. Cale stepped closer, lowering his voice so the others wouldn't hear. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." The girl's silver eyes flickered with faint light, and Cale saw something strange reflected in them, something that felt like hope. But as the wind shifted across the plateau, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead of them. Warpath. The sky split open with fire. Cal Thorne sprinted through the ruins, his squad close behind. The girl ran beside him, silver eyes glowing as the artifact pulsed in her hands. Behind them, the Drawl warlord's battalion clashed with the dark figures emerging from the fractured air. The gate was opening. Cale didn't need to understand ancient alien technology to know that much. The rumble beneath his feet and the distorted sky told him all he needed to know. "We can't outrun this," Haynes shouted, firing a burst of plasma rounds over his shoulder. The bullets passed through the shadowy figures like smoke, but they slowed their advance, if only briefly. "We're not trying to outrun it," Cale replied, ducking behind a half-collapsed wall. "We're trying to buy time." Haynes crouched beside him, panting. "For what?" Cale glanced at the girl. She stood calmly in the open, the artifact in her hands burning brighter by the second. "For her," Cale said simply. Haynes swore under his breath, but didn't argue. The girl lifted the artifact, her gaze fixed on the sky, as the flickering rift expanded overhead. "They're coming faster now," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Cale adjusted his grip on his rifle. "Then slow them down." The girl lowered the artifact slowly, but there was hesitation in her movements. Cale stepped closer. "You've done this before," he said carefully. "Haven't you?" She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers traced the glowing lines of the artifact, as if drawing strength from it. "I tried once," she admitted softly. "A long time ago. But I wasn't strong enough." Cal's eyes narrowed. "And now?" The girl met his gaze. "I don't know if I can control it. If I lose focus, it won't stop with them." Cal's pulse quickened. "Then don't lose focus," he said firmly. Her grip on the artifact tightened, and Cal saw the faintest flicker of fear behind her calm expression. But she nodded. The ground trembled violently as another surge of figures poured from the rift. The Drell forces fought savagely, but Cal could see it wasn't enough. The enemy wasn't just fighting to win. They were fighting to consume. Cal turned to his squad. "We hold this line. No one gets past us." Marks tightened the strap on his rifle. "With respect, Sarge, there's a whole damn army getting past us right now." Cal smirked faintly. "Then we'll slow them down the hard way." The first wave. The first figure materialized directly in front of Cal, its shape twisting and reforming like smoke caught in a strong wind. Cal fired point-blank. The bullets tore through it, but the creature reformed almost instantly. "Come on," Cal growled, slamming his rifle butt into the figure's chest. This time, the creature staggered backward, as if Cal's defiance had weight. Haynes unleashed a volley of explosives, scattering the nearest group of figures. "We can't kill them," Haynes shouted, "but we can make them mad." "That's the spirit," Cal replied. The girl stepped forward, raising the artifact high. Its glow intensified until the shadows around them recoiled. "Stay close to me," she said. The figures hesitated now, their advance faltering under the artifact's light. Cal could feel the energy shifting, like the battlefield itself was holding its breath. "Whatever you're doing," Haynes muttered, "do it faster." The girl's eyes narrowed. The artifact pulsed, and the first figure dissolved into ash, turning the tide. More figures faded, their forms unraveling as the artifact's power spread across the battlefield. The Drell warlord glanced toward the girl, his expression unreadable, but Cal saw something close to respect in his gaze. "She's doing it," Marks whispered, almost in disbelief. Cal didn't relax. "She hasn't won yet." The rift in the sky roared, and something larger began to emerge. A towering figure wrapped in dark tendrils that coiled like living chains. The girl stumbled, her hands trembling as the artifact flickered. Cal caught her before she fell. "Stay with me," he urged. Her breathing was shallow, but she nodded. "I can't hold it back alone," she whispered. Cal squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're not alone." The squad tightened their formation, shielding the girl as the monstrous figure stepped fully through the gate. Cal lifted his rifle, staring down the towering shadow. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what you've got." The final push. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but in truth, it was only minutes. The girl's strength waned, but the artifact's light held, keeping the worst of the figures at bay. The Drell warlord fought beside Cal now, their unspoken alliance forged in the fire of necessity. As the last shadowy figure crumbled, the sky finally began to close. The girl lowered the artifact, and the glow faded. Cal exhaled heavily, lowering his rifle. "It's over," Haynes said breathlessly. Cal wasn't so sure. The girl turned to Cal, her silver eyes dimming. "For now," she said. Cal stared at the rift, watching as the last traces of light disappeared. "For now," he echoed grimly. "Legacy." The battlefield was quiet now. Cal Thorne stood at the edge of the plateau, staring out over the valley where the final echoes of the rift had faded. The ground was littered with the remnants of the Drell forces and the ashes of the shadows that had tried to break through. But it was the silence that felt strange. Not the heavy, ominous kind he had grown used to during the conflict, but the silence that followed victory, the kind that didn't feel real yet. The girl stood beside him, the artifact no longer glowing but cool and lifeless in her hands. Her silver eyes reflected the faint light of the rising sun, though her expression was distant, as if she were listening for something Kel couldn't hear. "They won't stop," she said softly, breaking the stillness. Kel glanced at her. "I didn't think they would." The droll warlord approached slowly, his heavy footsteps crunching over broken stone. He studied the girl for a long moment before speaking. "The gate is sealed," the warlord said, his voice rough. "For now." Kel nodded. "That's the second time I've heard those words today." The warlord's eyes flicked to Kel. "You fought well, human. But you know as well as I do, this was not the end. Only a delay." Kel didn't argue. He could feel it in his bones. The girl's grip on the artifact tightened. "It's not over because the gate isn't gone," she said quietly. "As long as it exists, they'll find a way back." The warlord folded his arms across his broad chest. "Then perhaps it is time for the gate to be destroyed." The girl looked up at him. "You can't destroy it. It's not just a door." Kel frowned. "Then what is it?" She hesitated. "It's part of something larger. If you destroy the gate, the pieces scatter. And the next time they return, there won't be just one opening." Kel felt Haynes shift uneasily behind him. "So we're supposed to just leave it alone?" "No," the girl said softly. "Someone has to guard it." Kel didn't miss the way her eyes lingered on the artifact. The warlord grunted. "We have lost too many warriors already. The Drawl cannot afford to bleed for a war that has no end." Kel's gaze narrowed. "Funny. I thought that was the whole point of being a soldier." The warlord regarded Kel for a long moment, then turned without another word, leading what was left of his forces down the plateau. Kel watched them go until they disappeared over the horizon. Haynes exhaled loudly. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I almost miss those lizards." Kel smirked faintly. "Don't get sentimental on me now." Haynes glanced at the girl. "So, what happens to her?" Kel looked at the artifact in her hands, the same question hanging heavily in his mind. "She comes with us," Kel said finally. Haynes raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" Kel nodded. "Just like that." The girl shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure how to feel about the decision. "I thought you'd want to be rid of me." Kel knelt in front of her, his expression softening. "You kept us alive. I think we owe you the same." The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Besides," Kel added with a small grin, "someone's got to make sure you don't open any more gates." She almost smiled, but her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I didn't open it. I just woke it up." Kel rose to his feet, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Then let's make sure it stays asleep this time." As the squad prepared to move out, Kel felt the weight of the artifact still lingering in the air, like the echo of a storm that had passed, but left behind the scent of rain. This wasn't the end. He knew that much. But for now, they had bought themselves time. And sometimes, in wars like this, time was the best victory you could hope for.